So, Chapter 27 of Boruto's 2 Blue Vortex has officially leaked, and I was wrong about everything. I mean, like, everything. Every theory, every idea, every conclusion I came to wrong. See, not only was the battle between Sarada and Daemon settled in a way that I very much did not want it to be settled, but also the contentious moment between Sarada and Ada was settled in a way that I very much did not see coming. Tie that into the fact that the first official leak from the Naruto team was the biggest pump fake I've literally ever seen in the history of being a Boruto fan, and throw in some wild exposition about Enojin getting a new jutsu, Sumire upgrading Boruto's Kusanagi blade with information from the future, and the unveiling of Mamushi's techniques and weaknesses, and you have not only one of the more jam-packed chapters in the history of Boruto, but also one that defies basically all expectations. Now, as to whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing, well, we're gonna get into that, because today we're talking Chapter 27 of Boruto's 2 Blue Vortex Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video every single week, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. That is a half hour of additional Nick time you get every single week for just $5 a month. So, Chapter 27 of 2 Blue Vortex starts off basically exactly where Chapter 26 left off. That is, with Daemon with his hands around Sarada and Sumire's necks. Now, rather interestingly, while the chapter does start with some heavy focus on Sarada's left eye, that left eye no longer has a Mangekyo Sharingan activated. It's gone back to Sarada's base eye, implying that Sarada was most likely not able to do anything with the Mangekyo Sharingan before Daemon was able to speed blitz her, which means that all the optimistic theories that spun out of Chapter 26's ending, the most prevalent of which being that we were going to get to see Sarada's other Mangekyo Sharingan ability, which was most likely Genjutsu base, and instead of Daemon actually holding on to Sarada and Sumire's necks, he was actually still leaning against the wall, caught in a Genjutsu that Sarada put him in before he was able to get to them. But nope, because that would make Sarada powerful. I mean, sure, we've spent a lot of time actively trying to set her up to be as powerful as people like Boruto or Kawaki, but you know, when it comes to Daemon, apparently she's got nothing she can do. Because when Daemon said, sure, your Mangekyo Sharingan is real spiffy, but if I kill you before you can fuse it, yeah, it can't really do anything. And apparently he was right. Now, this is obviously a possibility that we talked about that could unfold in Chapter 27. Our least favorite possibility, because it immediately places Daemon leagues ahead of Sarada in terms of strength, but obviously, yes, because this is a Naruto universe manga, a possibility. Now, on the next page, we see that this fight isn't really actually a fight, because Daemon immediately lets go of Sarada and Sumire's necks. And while still crouched behind the two of them, he looks at them and says, you understand it now, right? I can kill you on a whim. You won't even notice you're dead by the time I've disposed of you. Really cementing the fact that, yeah, Daemon is leagues stronger than Sarada and Sumire combined. Before either of them were even able to get up off the couch, Daemon was able to speed blitz them, grab their neck in such a way that he could have snapped them and they would be gone. Now, as to what that means for how strong Ryu was, considering the fact that Sarada with Ohirame was able to pretty much no-diff him, we can't really say. But it could also just mean that Daemon is absurdly powerful, like almost Jura level powerful. Because while we really have no metric to compare the strength of Ryu or Hidari to Jura, because obviously they've never fought, if Boruto can basically no-diff Hidari, and Sarada can basically no-diff Ryu, Daemon can snap Sarada's neck before she can literally move. You gotta assume he's somewhere near Jura. At the very least, if it comes to blows with Mamushi, Daemon should not struggle. That's the big thing to take away from this. If Daemon is laughably stronger than Sarada, on account of the fact that she knew he was gonna attack, she activated her Mangekyo Sharingan and she could still do nothing. And Sarada, with that very same Mangekyo Sharingan, was able to destroy Ryu, who is also a Shinju, and there is no reason for us to believe that Mamushi is stronger than Ryu. In fact, Mamushi should be weaker than Ryu, based on the fact that Mamushi was made from bug and Ryu was made from the next Kaze Kage. Then if at any point it is established that Daemon is struggling with Mamushi, I am going to need an incredible explanation. As you can see by my demeanor, not super happy about this. Anyways, Sarada, in the third page, now apparently the helpless damsel that she was always destined to be, turns to Daemon with a meek weakness in her voice and says, "You're not gonna kill us?" At which point, Ada continues her monologue from chapter 26, where she says, "No matter how you think about it, the idea of you guys not being affected by my charm Shinjutsu is weird. Why are the two of you who are not Otsutsukis not affected by my omnipotence?" And it's important to note here that omnipotence in this context not only applies to the idea of Boruto being swapped with Kawaki position-wise, but also Ada's charm Shinjutsu, which is a bifactor of omnipotence, and Ada's subconscious wish for everyone to like her. Ada continues on by saying, "Is it because you had your heart stolen by a fellow Otsutsuki in Boruto? No, that can't be it. There's plenty of girls in this village that have had their hearts flutter when either they looked at Boruto or Kawaki." Now, this right here is a pretty important talking point. For literally years, we've been trying to figure out why Sarada and Sumire are unaffected by the omnipotence of Ada. Was it because they were in love with Boruto? That's one of the most common theories. Was it because somehow, some way, they have Sage of Six Paths chakra? That's another one of the most common theories. Does it have something to do with Sarada's Sharingan? Well, apparently, it's none of those things. But Ada goes on to say it can't be because they're in love with Boruto, because if that's all it took, there would be plenty of girls inside of Konoha who are unaffected by her omnipotence. And therefore, there's really only one reason that Ada can think of as to why Sarada and Sumire would specifically be left out of the effects of omnipotence. And that is Ada. Yep. Nothing that Sarada or Sumire did. It's all Ada. To the conclusion that Ada comes to, and considering the fact that this is Ada's ability, probably the objectively right opinion on this matter is that Ada made an exception herself for Sarada and Sumire. A subconscious choice made by Ada to exclude Sarada and Sumire from the effects of omnipotence. Now, Sumire, who's probably just as boggled as the rest of you here, naturally asks, why? Why would you make an exclusion for us? At which point, Ada brings up a flashback from part 1 of Boruto about something that Sarada said to Ada, where Sarada, Sumire, and Ada were all sitting in a gigantic bed, where Sarada said to Ada, "Let's all just become normal friends." Now, Ada begins to talk about how that made her incredibly happy, because for as long as she could remember, even long before she met either Sarada or Sumire, she'd wished for proper human relationships. And that's important, I guess, because the counter argument to this idea that Ada made a subconscious exclusion for Sarada and Sumire to not be affected by her omnipotence kind of falls flat when you consider the fact from the very first time that Sarada and Sumire met Ada, that is to say, the very first time they should have been affected by her charm Shinjutsu, they weren't affected. And therefore, Ada would have to make an exclusion for Sarada and Sumire before she even met them, or like while meeting them. Like she saw Sarada and Sumire and like subconsciously went, "No, I don't want them affected. I want to be real friends with them," which is fine. Like it's fine, because like it's not bad writing. It really isn't. See, here's the thing: the relationship between Sarada, Sumire, and Ada is actually a pretty healthy dynamic, and the three of them are written like real life friends. Like, yeah, they talk a lot about boys, but so do girls their age. At least I think. What the fuck do I know about what 15-year-old girls talk about? But like I'm assuming that's what they be talking about. That, or I don't know, Justin Bieber. That's what they talked about when I was 15. So hey. But these three girls living in a world of chaos created by one of them objectively, though subconsciously, coming together as friends is actually kind of sweet. And the important thing is they want to be friends because they like each other. Yes, Sarada and Sumire have this head-butting thing about which one of them is going to end up with Boruto. And yes, Ada is incredibly invested in what happens there, but who wouldn't be? So like, is it the best possible explanation that the reason that Sarada and Sumire are unaffected by omnipotence is because Ada has always subconsciously wanted a real human relationship? I'm not gonna say no. Like, it's touching and it's good character development for Ada. And like, at the end of the day, this is a story. It doesn't always have to be about punching. So it doesn't have to be some big reveal that Sarada and Sumire have Sage of Six Paths power that devolves into some kind of ridiculous transformation, and that's why they were unaffected by omnipotence. Sometimes it can just be friendship. So while this isn't the direction that I saw the story going in, it's not the worst possible direction, especially considering how this conversation plays out. See, because Ada goes on and says, after all this time, I don't think either of you have any intention of harming me. That, and well, if you two were the ones who did me in, I don't think that would be the worst possible thing. Now at this moment, we see Sarada grab Sumire's hand and lunge at Ada. However, Daemon does not budge. And that's because Sarada grabbed Sumire and ran at Ada so the three of them could hug. And listen, this is an objectively kind of sweet moment. Like Ada, who subconsciously manifested a ridiculously powerful shinjutsu move to make the entire world like her, has now lived in kind of a perpetual hellscape where she can't have a real relationship with anyone because she knows, unfortunately, they're gonna be forced against their will to like her. And then she's trapped in a be careful what you wish for kind of situation. Subconsciously, she opened herself up to being hurt both physically and emotionally by allowing for Sarada and Sumire, two prospective friends, to be unaffected by omnipotence. And the gamble paid off because they want to be her friends. And that's actually kind of beautiful. Like, it's good character development, and it's a good story about allowing people to come into your life and letting your walls come down, because you can't know love until you open yourself up to the prospect of pain. And that kind of storytelling is important in shonen mangas like this. It doesn't have to be tied to some ridiculous godlike power. Or even, the more that I think about it, it doesn't have to be tied to the fact that these two girls like a boy. See, separating Boruto from the equation here and putting the onus of this openness on Ada is actually something that Kishimoto never would have done. Allowing for the driving force behind this moment to just be the women in the equation is actually a pretty big step for Naruto. So while, like, yes, I would have loved for Sarada to put up even the remotest of a fight against Daemon, I really have no beef, and in fact, I actually quite like the reveal of why Sarada and Sumire are unaffected by Ada's omnipotence. Now, Ada is taken aback by this hug, and she asks Sarada what's with the unexpected bold hug, at which point Sarada lets her know that it's a symbol of her resolve and her commitment to their friendship. It's at this point that Sumire chips in and says, I don't hate it. Risking our lives for friendship is the kind of thrill that I can get behind, because obviously Sarada and Sumire risked their lives running at Ada because Daemon could have killed them. And it's this point and this point alone that Ada finally hugs the two of them back, as Daemon watches on with a smile on his face. So will there be a future battle between Daemon and Sarada? No, probably not. However, the Naruto universe is learning how to write women a little bit better, so, you know, win-loss situation? Listen, I'll always take better writing over more punches, and this is a better writing moment. Anyways, we then cut to Kashin Koji, who's still having the conversation with Shikamaru that he was having in chapter 26, and we pick up on the conversation exactly where we left it off. That is to say that Kashin Koji is telling Shikamaru about Mamushi's powers and his weaknesses. So Kashin Koji goes on to tell Shikamaru that Mamushi is basically twice. He has the ability to split apart, and no, he's not talking about shadow clones. Mamushi is able to split his body into an infinite amount of clones. However, these splits are not shadow clones, they're real bodies. Every single one of Mamushi's split-offs is a real body of Mamushi's. On top of this, his chakra is not split, so every single split of Mamushi's is as powerful as the other splits. There is no decline in his power, his chakra, or his physical strength. Sounds broken, right? Yeah, it kind of is. Especially considering the fact that apparently, according to Kashin Koji, his only weakness is that the more he splits himself, the more his intelligence falls, and rather sharply at that. And considering the fact that Mamushi already isn't the brightest bulb in Las Vegas, his cognitive decline probably isn't the best idea for Mamushi. On top of this, the more he divides, the lower his pain threshold gets, and his movements become more and more simplified. So like, it is kind of shadow clone-esque, because the more he splits himself, technically the weaker his splits get, as they can be defeated easier, they move more simply, and they're dumber, but they all are technically full-powered Mamushis. And thus Shikamaru comes to the conclusion that they should allow for Mamushi to multiply as many times as possible. And when all the Mamushis turn into raving idiots, essentially take all of them out all at once. Now, Kashin Koji agrees that that is a good plan. However, there is one more important thing to note, and that is that while they're trying to take out all these raving Mamushis, they have to make sure to destroy both of his eyes, both of his Rinnegan, because only a Mamushi that's had both of his Rinnegan destroyed is unable to split further. However, there's another catch, because for every Mamushi that's destroyed, all of the other Mamushis will get more intelligent. And thus Shikamaru begins to realize the gravity of the situation. See, because if Konoha's forces are able to destroy all but 4 or 5 Mamushis, they'll get intelligent, and they'll be able to launch a counterattack. They'll also be able to split themselves once again. However, if they allow for too many Mamushis to be made, then they'll have no way to take control of the situation. And yeah, Shikamaru is essentially right here, as Kashin Koji says, yeah, aim for 20 or 30. At 20 or 30, he'll become easier to handle. And at that point, it'll be like you're fighting an animal that we can herd up and destroy the entire herd all at once. Now, as to how they're going to destroy 30 Mamushis with one move, I I cannot say. Like maybe one of Kawaki's big old dark blasts? Because that's pretty much the only ability that anyone in Konoha has that could destroy 30 Shinju in one blow, outside of maybe a tailed beast bomb from Himawari. But she has very little control over Jinchuriki mode, and her tailed beast bombs don't explode all that big. They're more like sniper-like. But I guess that's for Shikamaru and Kashin Koji to figure out off screen, so we don't know exactly how it's gonna go down, so we can be like, oh my god, that was a big explosion from Himawari, or something like that. But anyways, Ikimoto, through the medium of Shikamaru, realizes, oh, well, if you give somebody a doubling ability, they can always leave a body behind, especially if all of their bodies are their true bodies and are operating at full strength. And therefore Shikamaru asks Kashin Koji, well, what if he leaves one of his bodies behind at the hideout? Doesn't that mean even if we exterminate all of the Mamushis, that one Mamushi will be left behind to make more Mamushi? But Ikimoto answers his own self-proposed question because he knows fans like me will be like, why did Mamushi do this? As Kashin Koji lets Shikamaru know that all of his parts have a proclivity for swarming. That is to say that Mamushi or Mamushis don't like to be separate from each other. Even if he plans to leave one Mamushi back at the hideout, it would instinctively run to where all the other ones were. And Shikamaru was like, yeah, that makes sense. Why? Why does that make sense to you, Shikamaru? It's the most half-assed explanation of all time, but sure, yeah, it's an explanation. Nah, I can't leave one behind because they get FOMO, you know? And Shikamaru was like, oh yeah, me too. Whatever, it's fine. He's like a tertiary antagonist. Anyways, after all the actuallyers have been quelled by Ikimoto, Enojin hops into the conversation and asks an actually important question, which is, hey, why do we have to fight him in Konoha? If we know where he's going to be, can't we intercept him? To which Kashin Koji responds to by saying, the reason we're fighting him in Konoha is to make sure that Jura doesn't show up. See, Jura's goal is to kill Boruto and consume Himawari. And therefore, if either of them show up on the battlefield, Jura will also show up, unless the battlefield is in Konoha. At which point, Kashin Koji and Shikamaru both begin to explain to Enojin that for some reason or another, Jura has taken a liking to Konoha. In fact, he often frequents bookstores and sweet shops. And it's at this point that we get the page that was leaked by the Naruto team, where we see Jura sitting outside of a dango shop eating dango by himself. Now, this report that Jura just pops into Konoha freaks out Enojin, as he asks Shikamaru, seriously? To which Shikamaru responds by saying, yeah, the sensory unit just reports him as being inside of Konoha, but all we can do is leave him be. I've even ordered the Konoha police to not do anything about his presence. And that's that. So much for Jura delivering an ultimatum to Konoha. So much for him sitting on one side of a bench waiting for Himawari to come talk to him. It's just a scene used as exposition to explain to Enojin that Jura shows up in Konoha sometimes. Wow, I feel like a numerologist. I feel like those people who listen to Taylor Swift songs with a notepad out looking for Easter eggs. This is the most nothing page in the entire chapter, and they leaked it to us to make it look like Jura popping into Konoha this chapter was a big event, but nope, it's exposition. I shoot the ball, I miss. So the moratorium hasn't been lifted on Konoha, and Himawari and Jura are not going to be coming face to face anytime soon, which eliminates the most interesting possibility that we talked about as to why Mamushi would be allowed to attack Konoha. But fortunately, the second most interesting possibility is the one that's actually going to play out. See, there is still a moratorium on attacking Konoha, and Mamushi understands that. He understands that destroying Konoha is unacceptable. Mamushi does operate under the will of Jura. Jura is in charge of what he does, and therefore Mamushi invading Konoha is not something that Jura would want, and therefore Mamushi in his invasion of Konoha is gonna try to not destroy it as much as possible, even if he becomes an idiot, which is a question that Boruto asks, because Kashin Koji lets everybody know, regardless of how low his intelligence drops, his fear of Jura and the incurment of his wrath is literally primal. It's an instinct. However, so is the primal urge that pulls him to Ada. And this is a possibility that we talked about, that Mamushi's will to consume Ada is so all-consuming that he's willing to incur the wrath of Jura to accomplish his goal. But this means that during the battle with Mamushi, that Konoha is going to be mostly unaffected from like a destruction standpoint. And therefore, that's why it's ideal to challenge Mamushi inside of Konoha. Because one, it won't be destroyed, and two, Boruto and Himawari could join in the fight against Mamushi and Jura would not join. Now, to this point, the topic of conversation switches to Enojin, as Kashin Koji looks over to him and says, Enojin, I'm gonna have you master a new jutsu. Kashin Koji lets Enojin know that learning this jutsu will be pivotal in the battle against Mamushi, and that this jutsu is a brand new jutsu that's reverse compatible with the mind transfer technique. And in actuality, even though Kashin Koji being connected to Shikamaru so the two of them could talk is useful, the real reason that Kashin Koji brought Enojin to Boruto and Kashin Koji's hideout is so that Enojin could learn this new jutsu. Kashin Koji continues on by saying that Mamushi is going to arrive in Konoha sometime in the next week, and that in actuality it could be even sooner. Either way, Kashin Koji needs Enojin to perfect this new jutsu in the next 2 days. Now this catches Enojin off guard, because 2 days isn't enough time to learn basically anything, especially something that Enojin knows nothing about. However, Kashin Koji lets Enojin know that this should be something he's able to master rather quickly, on account of the fact that it's a jutsu that he himself thought up. A jutsu that he himself thought up in order to enact vengeance for the loss of Himawari. Now obviously there's a lot to unpack from that sentence. Pretty obviously here, Kashin Koji is doing the thing with Enojin that he's done with a lot of other people. Whether it was telling Boruto about Kawaki's limiters that were dampening his offensive output, or telling Boruto about Rasengan Uzuhiko, Kashin Koji has several times told people about jutsus that they develop in the future. However, the other big takeaway here is that in this future timeline where Enojin develops his jutsu, Himawari dies, presumably consumed by Jura. And while that's not insane, obviously there's a fair amount of universes where Himawari dies, it does highlight the stakes of these battles. Now the concept of Himawari's death forces Enojin to lock in, because obviously Enojin wants to be with Himawari. And as Kashin Koji notices Enojin locking in, he says, okay, yeah, let's get started. But Enojin lets Kashin Koji that he doesn't need 2 days if it's for saving Himawari, he'll master the jutsu in 1. And it's like, love the energy, but you have 2 days. All while Boruto watches on silently, still leaning on his throne with his chin on his fist. And you might be like, wow, Boruto's looking real Momoshiki-esque in this chapter. Don't worry, that theory's also probably dead. We'll get to why in a second. Anyways, after this, we cut away from the least ventilated boys' hideout in the history of time and pop over to Kawaki and Amado. We're watching back the fight between Kawaki and Jura from the videotape that was collected by Kawaki's eyes. And Kawaki is looming over a smoking Amado, asking him if he found anything by watching their fight. Now, Amado goes on to tell Kawaki that it's a bit hard to make out from the video, but there's definitely something inside of Jura. On top of this, the trees that he's controlling is the divine tree itself. Now, this is interesting because it does give a little bit of credence to a theory we've been sitting on for a little while here. The idea that the wood release used by the Shinju, and therefore possibly the wood release used by Hashirama, is actually just controlling the network of roots of the divine tree that run through the earth, and therefore Jura's ability to control the roots of the divine tree in somewhere like the land of wind confirms that in some capacity the roots of the divine tree still exist all throughout the globe, giving more credence to the idea that the reason that wood release is able to drain chakra from the tailed beast isn't because trees absorb energy to grow, rather because the divine tree is literally made from a 10 tails. In the roots of a divine tree are specifically made to absorb chakra. And therefore in the video we made a couple of months ago called We Were Wrong About Wood Release, I actually might have been right. We maybe have been wrong about wood release. Now of course this could only apply to Jura's wood release, but it's some pretty compelling evidence. Now Amado continues on by saying not only does it heal his injuries, but it also operates as an impenetrable shield. And so Kawaki says, so what? Does he have any weak points? At which point Amado lets him know it's not just about weak points. You should look at Jura as literally invincible. And this is so interesting to me because if we're assuming that the reason that Jura is seen as invincible is because of his access to the divine tree, what separates Jura from somebody like Madara who absorbed an entire divine tree? Why was Madara beatable when Jura isn't? Is it because of his implicit control of a divine tree? Because we've seen people with control of a divine tree like Kaguya, who was also defeatable. And therefore there's a ton of wood release related questions and divine tree related questions that we need to try and figure out answers to. So we'll be doing that in the next video we post on this channel. So, you know. Anyways, Kawaki's sick of all of the doom and gloom from Amado, and he lets him know that he's beatable. He could feel it when they fought, that there was a way that Kawaki could kill Jura. It's just that currently he doesn't have enough firepower, but if he had enough firepower, he'd be able to take out Jura. But Amado shuts that down immediately, as he tells Kawaki if he gets any stronger than he is right now, his body wouldn't be able to take it. But Kawaki, not a big fan of that idea, so he scoops up Amado by his favorite place to grab him, his neck, asking him, while he's got him in his uppies, if he should crush his throat, and that he should do what he says without the useless back talk. It's this point that he begins to make an appeal to Amado's more, let's call it, emotional side, as he tells him if he wants any help with his daughter, he's gonna help him get as powerful as possible. But Amado, even after he's dropped by Kawaki, continues on by saying, if I give you any more power, your body will not hold. But Kawaki doesn't flinch, telling Amado to not only make him not repeat himself, but also telling him that Amado's wish will not be granted until all of his enemies are God, telling Amado that he'll either kill all of his enemies or die first, and it's time that Amado places his chips on the table for what side he believes is going to win. We then cut away from that young man abusing an elder to a room where an elder with governmental power is abusing a young man. As we pop into the interrogation that's happening between the right hand of the Fire Daimyo and Konohamaru, as Konohamaru is making a plea with I don't remember his name about his innocence. That is to say, about how he didn't help Boruto escape from captivity. So Konohamaru is telling, we'll just call him Gray Stripe, that he was the one who interrogated Boruto in accordance with his orders. But Gray Stripe tells him that that doesn't serve as proof of his innocence, that is. And in fact, that's exactly what a mole would say. And that's why he's here right now. And that's why Gray Stripe is conducting this investigation. Konohamaru goes on to just give way too much information as he tells Gray Stripe that at the moment of his interrogation, he resented Boruto. But now, he actually doesn't. And in fact, Konohamaru goes so far as to say that he feels as though there's some kind of inconsistency with his public image as a traitor, implying that Konohamaru in some kind of way is breaking out of the brainwashing of omnipotence, just organically, because Boruto has done a lot to save him. Now, Gray Stripe goes on to say, I have no idea about what kind of situations you're getting involved in, but I believe you're being manipulated, presumably by Boruto. On top of that, dude, we are actively interrogating you to see if you are a traitor. Do not say you bang with Boruto. However, Gray Stripe realizes that Konohamaru is so straight-laced and kind of unintelligent that he'd pretty much be the worst kind of mole you could ever ask for, and therefore he's probably not the mole within Konoha. And it's like, I've never really looked at Konohamaru as the most intelligent guy in Konoha, but do we have to say he's so stupid he couldn't be a spy? That feels hurtful to one of the oldest Naruto characters in the universe, as in, not like oldest as in like age, I mean like one of the first people to show up. Anyways, Gray Stripe comes to the realization that the person who aided in Boruto's escape must have been somebody else. And it's at this point that somebody else pops into Konohamaru's head, saying, hey, Konohamaru, it's me, Shikamaru, reply without using your voice. And I guess like, wow, apparently Konohamaru is so dumb, people have to tell him to not talk out loud. Anyway, Shikamaru goes on to tell Konohamaru all about how it was him who actually helped Boruto escape, at which point Sai, who was also in the room, pretty much immediately clocks that Konohamaru was talking to somebody in his head, as he just starts giving him some real blank stares. But anyway, Shikamaru just starts telling Konohamaru about how he gave Mitsuki the passcode to Boruto's cuffs, and how he's been working with Boruto for a long time, because Shikamaru believes that Boruto is actually in the right. However, Shikamaru understands now with the mounting pressure from the elders and the daimyo to find Boruto, it's really only a matter of time until people realize that it was Shikamaru who aided Boruto's escape. And therefore, Shikamaru makes an earnest plea to Konohamaru to work with all of them and to lend them their strength, implying that Konohamaru has officially joined Team Boruto. But Konohamaru, who's apparently so stupid that he was probably muttering the words that he was saying to Shikamaru under his breath out loud, is just getting grilled by Sai this entire conversation. And Sai, who's essentially become the Waffen SS of Konoha ever since Omnipotence was fired off, like taking away his crop top wasn't a big enough assassination of his character, just looks deeply suspicious of whatever is going on with Konohamaru. And I mean, like, yeah, I know that it's not his fault, and yeah, he's the head of the Ombu. He should probably be a pretty perceptive guy. But like, I don't know, Sai's gotten disrespected his entire life. Can we just give him a shining moment? Anyways, back to pillow talk, as we then pop from a very unfriendly interrogation to a friendly interrogation as we head back to Ada's hillside mansion, where Sumire is bidding her adieu to Ada and Sarada, telling them that she needs to head back to the labs, and thus Sarada's like, yeah, maybe I should get going too, but Ada doesn't let her leave, because apparently they're not done. And even though Sarada pleads with Sumire to help her get out, Sumire smiles, chuckles, and says, yeah, no, it's all up to you. And it's a good thing for all you Boro Sumi shippers that they didn't leave together, because the king of aura farming in the Naruto world, the nonchalant young prince, is posted up outside of Ada's house waiting for Sumire. And therefore, as Sumire runs out Ada's front door, Boruto hits her with a yo. I'm like, he's got to be studying under Piccolo or something. It's just nonchalant as hell. Now, Sumire is obviously surprised to see Boruto. Before they can even get to talking, Boruto pulls out Sasuke's sword, his Kusanagi blade. Yes, there is multiple Kusanagi blades. It's a kind of blade in the Naruto universe. And while holding this blade in front of Sumire, he coats it in lightning chakra, using Uchiha sword-style cloaked blade. And he tells Sumire about how if you cloak your blade in chakra constantly, it stops it from getting dull or nicked. But because Boruto let his guard down for just 1 second, this ended up happening. And then we focus in on the big chip that Jura was able to inflict upon his blade in their last fight. Now, because this is essentially an heirloom sword given to him by his master, Sasuke, Boruto wants to take exceedingly good care of it. And thus Boruto hands the sword over to Sumire and says, "Sorry, Prez, but can you have this fixed by the end of the week?" Now, Sumire is surprised by this as she asks him, "You want me to fix this?" But Boruto assuages her worries by handing her a scroll. Now, apparently within the confines of this scroll is the end result of the research that Sumire is doing right now. And therefore, obviously, because Kashin Koji can see the future, he was able to see what the end of Sumire's research would yield. And therefore, they scribbled those results into a scroll, and now Boruto is giving that scroll to Sumire, cutting out years of scientific research. Now, Sumire is obviously astounded by this. Boruto tells her that he can't give her any more details other than the fact that this is the conclusion she was going to come to. And therefore, he asks again, "Can you fix the sword?" Now, Sumire lets Boruto know that if she fixes the blade using this technique, that Boruto's sword will turn into something entirely different, saying that the sword itself will be reborn, which is crazy. But Boruto replies to her that this is a strong blade, and therefore I don't think my master will have any complaints. Now, as to what all of this could mean, I don't really know. I'm 99.99999% sure that the research that Sumire is doing has something to do with Nue. Whether it's the dark dimension that Nue is from, Hashirama cells that were used to make Nue, or his ability to siphon off chakra, there is something going on with Nue and Sumire's research around Nue that is somehow going to be applied to this sword. However, my knowledge of Nue is so incredibly limited that I feel as though that I can't come to that conclusion right now. However, with a couple of days of research, I feel like I'm going to be able to figure out exactly what's going to happen to Boruto's Kusanagi blade. Make sure you're following the page because that research is going to get done soon. However, before Sumire runs off with this new information in Boruto's sword, she says, "Before I fix this, there's just one problem. I don't like being called Prez. Call me Sumire from now on." Now, this kind of gobsmacks Boruto, who's left literally speechless. And Sumire teehees as she runs away, telling Boruto that she's going to make his sword so much cooler and she's so excited to give it back to him. And that's it. But that's also kind of progress in the Boruto x Sumire camp, so I guess the four of you can be excited. Anyways, we then flash forward to a couple days later, and we see that Mamushi has scaled Konoha's walls, as he and four of his clones look down at Konoha and wonder aloud where Ada could possibly be hiding. And the last thing we hear from chapter 27 of Two Blue Vortex is one of the Mamushis telling all the other Mamushi to erase their chakra signatures so they're not identified when they go through the sensory boundary. And with that, chapter 27 ends, and therefore with chapter 28 begins the invasion of Konoha, a battle against a seemingly endless flow of Mamushi's copies that'll involve people like Daemon, Himawari, and Boruto. Possibly the largest scale battle we've ever seen in Two Blue Vortex, and I am very excited. So how will it pan out? Will Konoha be destroyed? Will they be able to destroy the dual Rinnegan of all the Mamushi copies? And what move will they use to quell the horde? Well, we can't know until next month. But if you're excited for next month, let me know in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, Dorothy's not here. She's doing a photo shoot, and there's 11 dogs in this household. I cannot believe I actually found a window of time to record this video.